Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Omnia Performance Podcast with myself, Fergus Crawley, and with Kieran in the house. Say hello to the lovely people, Kieran.
Hello, pleasure to be here.
You didn't say hello to the lovely people, you just said hello.
Hello to all the lovely people out there.
All the lovely people.
All
wow, we're broadening. Yeah, there we go. Fantastic. So today we are going to discuss how to build your aerobic base. But before we do that, you are going to discuss how to subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're listening on. And it doesn't require much discussion. It just requires you to move your mouse or your fingertips over to the follow or subscribe button. And if you're watching on YouTube, please hit the like button too. And at any point, please do share a comment in the Spotify section or YouTube section. And if you want to share this episode or an episode previously with a friend, that would also be pretty sick. But not as sick as having a huge base, which allows you to have a wonderful foundation to do lots of other fitnessing. So your aerobic base is essentially your body's ability to utilize oxygen for sustained activity. And the higher the base, the more efficiently you can do that over time. So when you hear the word base training, when you hear the word zone 2, when you hear the word efficiency, when you hear the word aerobic, that is your body's ability to sort of sit at a low intensity over a sustained period of time. That will underpin your higher output as time goes on, will help your recovery between bouts of higher intensity, will underpin your ability to do more hard work, and that's an important point that we'll come on to a little bit later, because I think there's a lot of emphasis on aerobic base that maybe misses some of the key details around doing the hard stuff that actually brings up the ability in the first place. But that is kind of the context and the summary. Is there anything that you really want to highlight from the discussions you've had, Kieran, in terms of context?
I think for me, the simplest way to put it, and my favourite term for it, is engine building. I think it just puts so succinctly and nicely what we're talking about here. It allows you to, obviously, if you've got a bigger engine, you can pivot to so many different activities so easily. You don't necessarily have to want to go in one direction, as in going as fast as possible or as far as possible or being as good as you possibly can be in a certain distance. It just gives you options and freedom to, if you want to go explore a mountain or if you want to go for a nice run with somebody you've not run with before, then it's freedom, it's options. So I've always loved the term engine building for it, rightly or wrongly. Not very scientific, but there we are.
No, we'll keep today a little bit more top line, and I think in a conversation with Dr. Phil, we'll follow up and talk a little bit more detail about some of the nuance on, at top level, you can view things in sort of two thresholds, LT1 and LT2, whereas in most running communications, most cycling communications, there'll be a 5 or 4 zone system, and that's what most people are used to hearing about. So we'll talk in that context today, but then we'll deep dive a little bit more on zones, LT1, LT2, in a conversation with Dr. Phil over the next couple of weeks. So I think the first and most important thing to do when understanding how you can build your aerobic base is understanding your starting point. And look, I think anyone listening to this podcast will assume they have a little bit of training history, so I don't think it's wrong of us to say that most people would be capable of doing some sort of baseline testing that is more reliable than 220 minus age, because that is as reliable as it is unreliable and was formed in a very general term based on really quite non-relevant data to those that were going to be utilizing it. So look, if you've never ran a kilometre in your life before and you're listening to this, then I think the best thing to do would be to slowly increase your walking volume to then just go to a walk run and get to that point. But I think we will assume that most people listening are probably at the point where they can test their running, their cycling, even their swimming perhaps, with some sort of aerobic baseline testing. So the first and most important thing to do is to establish some parameters to operate within so that you can know how to train moving forwards, because you may have heard of the 80-20 principle. You may have heard of zone 2 being king. You may have heard that zone 3 is the grey area. You may have heard all of these things thrown around on the internet, but you don't quite know how to utilize or balance that, and you may not even know what any of these zones mean to you. Big thing to highlight off my back. If I hit somebody in the back with a bat, does that mean that slip of the tongue was correct? I'm not sure. I'm not planning on hitting anyone in the back with a bat unless Kieran says anything too insulting to me today. But nonetheless, the key thing off the bat, there we go, is we have a lot of conversations, very long way of getting there, wasn't it, with people that have Apple Watches, Garmin's, Coros's, Amazfits, whatever it might be, that take their zones that they are given as gospel on those devices, having not done any of the testing that is to establish those zones for them as an individual. This means that I think a lot of people have the perception that zone 2 is 140 to 148 beats per minute heart rate. Whereas for some people, that might be zone 1. For some people, that might be zone 3 or zone 4. We all have individual quirks. That's what makes us wonderfully unique. And there are anomalies within data sections and things that mean that we can be very variable here. Generally speaking, look, there's kind of a lot of people that sit in a pretty consistent middle ground. There's some people whose heart rate sits very high. There's some people whose heart rate sits very low. The only way you're going to know is through, 1, setting a baseline, and then 2, building on that over years and years of training with trial and error. And hopefully today we can help you understand where that starting point is so that you can be more informed moving forward. So we generally use lactate heart rate threshold testing for those that have devices as a test for running, which is a very simple premise. It's a very unfortunate premise if you're ever doing one, which is a 30-minute max distance run, max effort run, key detail as well, where you are setting off to cover as much distance in the 30 minutes as you can, but trying to pace it in a way where you're aiming for that 30-minute target. You're not hitting 100-meter pace, followed by 200-meter pace, followed by 400-meter pace, and just slowly blowing up and then dying for 27 minutes. The aim is for you to sort of work at a steady pace throughout and to find a real true max distance within that 30 minutes. You then take the average heart rate and the average pace for the final 20 minutes, and that will give you your lactate heart rate threshold zones and pacing. From there, you can use that data set and those parameters to establish what zones you're going to be operating in terms of heart rate and in terms of pacing. And then whether you're working with us or with somebody else or doing your own stuff, you can use that to form a training week within that zone system. On the bike, functional threshold power is the same. Power is a more dominant metric in cycling than heart rate is in running, but you can also use heart rate if you don't have access to power meters or things like that, and is a very, very reliable metric in a race setting as well. Very similar premise, an FTP test. You can do a single 20-minute max effort test and take 0.9 of that result. Was it 0.95, Kieran?
9.5, I think.
9.5, isn't it? Yeah, sorry, 0.9 is on the ramp test. That's 0.75, isn't it? Or you can take you can do the 5-minute all-out test, rest 10 minutes, 20-minute all-out test, and then take the data from that as the middle ground there. And then you take 0.9 of that result, and that will give you your FTP. So to summarize, 20 minutes all-out, or a ramp test on Zwift, or Wahoo system, or Training Peaks Virtual, or something like that, is the same premise as a lactate heart rate threshold testing as a way of establishing some parameters to work within. It will give you your heart rate data, and it will give you your power data on the bike. So from there, you know what zones you're operating it within, whether that's power, pacing, heart rate, or otherwise, and you can then implement those zones into your training so you know how much time you're spending in each zone, when you should be moving at what pace, at what heart rate, and then you can start to monitor any discrepancies that form, if there's fatigue that builds. And you can start to do some time committing to some true aerobic zone 2 work that can steadily build that base to allow you to do more hard work over time. So look, 220 minus age is popularly referred to. It's not useful for those that will be listening. We are, I would assume, past the point where you would need to rely on a generalized metric. There's then the MAF 180 principle, which again is working on generalized principles, much more reinforced generalized principles. It's worth mentioning it comes from a data set within running itself, which is much better than 220 minus age. But essentially, you are still working to generalized principles and generalized heart rate, not one specific to you. Can be great for base building because inadvertently you'll probably end up working in a sort of zone 1, zone 2 anyway by virtue of the way that system's structured. But the best thing to do in any situation, if you can, is to try and do a test that is individual to you to give you individual data so that you have individual parameters to work within. And then you can commit to 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks, reassess and see where you've made progress. Our training plans are structured with LTHR and FTP at the forefront. And generally speaking, we can work in heart rate, pacing, or power as well within that setup. But the key thing is knowing what 140 heart rate feels like, knowing how long you should be spending there, knowing if that's your zone 2, your zone 3, or otherwise, and understanding those parameters to start with. Anything to flag there, Kieran?
I think you've covered that pretty comprehensively. I think in terms of setting zones, we're pretty clear.
Wonderful. I think on that quick sub point, if you don't have a heart rate monitor, we recommend that you get one. It's a very useful training tool. But learning to do this by feel is a very valuable skill. It takes time. It takes a lot of time. But I think the more you can practice that, the better. We're very, very reliant on tech and data and things these days. I don't even have a watch on. Wow, I'm so free from the Matrix at this point. There we are. It's no Terminator takeover here for me. I just forgot to put my watch on, by the way. This is not a conscious decision. I'm panicking, thinking, where is my watch? But the key detail is, if you don't have a watch, you don't have a heart rate monitor, or you actually just want to go without data and try and improve your feel, the talk test, conversation test can be good. If you can hold sort of 7 or 8 words per sentence whilst moving, then you're probably in zone 2, mid to high zone 2. If you find yourself talking and then, okay, right, and then you're gasping for air a little bit, you're probably in zone 3, knocking on the door of zone 4. Zone 4, you shouldn't really be able to speak. Zone 5, Godspeed, soldier, I think is all we'll say on that one. And there's actually 3 subzones within 5, A, B, and C. 5C is, you're knocking on the door. If you've got a whoop on, it's probably phoning the police on your behalf at that point. But the key detail is you should be able to get a bit of a feel for how each zone feels. And a great way to do that, aerobically speaking, is because your body is turning over oxygen at a low intensity, you should have some oxygen reserved to be able to speak. If your body is turning over oxygen quicker and you therefore lose the ability to speak fluently, then you can assume that you are working at a higher output than is the desired outcome, in this case, aerobically. If you start to work anaerobically, it's going to be harder and harder to maintain that conversation, and therefore you pull back. Another method you can use is nasal breathing. Not for any weird and wacky, wonderful reasons in terms of mitochondrial density and parasympathetic nervous system and things like that. That's not something that we really focus on too much, but nasal breathing can be a fantastic form of throttle control when running or cycling, because if you are working harder than aerobically, you will likely not be able to sustain consistent breath through your nose, because you just won't be able to match the pace of oxygen required, because the volume of oxygen you can intake through your nose isn't as high as with your mouth. If you're very practiced at nasal breathing, doing all of the things that we mentioned beforehand, you'll likely lose that ability to differentiate between the two. But if you aren't practicing nasal breathing as an efficiency habit out with training, then generally speaking, your mouth will be able to intake a lot more breath than your nose will. Therefore, if you are moving aerobically, you should be able to breathe in through your nose consistently without it feeling like it's increasing and getting a bit panicky. And that works as a form of throttle control to keep you steady and to drill that sensation of feeling your zones rather than checking your watch all the time. So I think those are 2 things to consider there. And look, a combination of both is great. What you don't want to be is the person that turns up for a zone 2 run without a watch and goes, I can't do it now. I don't know what I'm doing. I'll miss my zone, and then go home. So in theory, we want you to be comfortable understanding the data as a tool, not treating it as gospel, and learning to feel your way through these zones as well. Because I think the thing that marathon training specifically has taught me better than anything else is a perception of zone 2, 3, 4, and 5 when running relative to pace and heart rate. But I could pretty accurately tell you what pace I'm moving at, what heart rate I'm at, based on how I'm breathing, how I'm feeling, because of that practice and that trial and error and that constant reflection. So yeah, data, watches, all these things are very, very useful tool. These heart rate zones are parameters to build within. They are not the be-all and end-all. There's inherent inaccuracies with this sort of tracking, but generally speaking, the closer you can control those inaccuracies, you're generally going to be getting closer and closer to the training zone that you're trying to elicit in the first place, because your body doesn't know the difference between what your watch is showing you versus what it's actually experiencing and adapting to, but we're trying to land them in the same sort of ballpark for all intents and purposes. So I think that's the sub point on the heart rate zones side of things. Anything you want to add there, Kieran?
I think the point you've made about not getting lost in the numbers, and particularly kind of trying to reduce the barrier to entry, is so important, because particularly, and I don't know if this is just one of the quirks of the industry at the moment, one of the selling points, but there's this idea that a lot of people are banding around that if you're not testing, you're guessing, and trying to push expensive lab tests and all this kind of thing. And it's just so completely unnecessary for the average person. And I think it's far more helpful to think of training in less binary terms. It's not there's right training and there's wrong training. It's a scale of more accurate to less accurate. So at one end, of course, you're always going to have lab testing be right at the top. But if you execute the lactate threshold heart rate testing properly with a chest strap, you are going to get 95% of the accuracy, if not near enough the same number. My thresholds, which have been set, yes, of course, I'm experienced and I always train with a chest strap. But when I did have my numbers tested in a lab, they were identical, genuinely to the beat per minute, not a single bit of discrepancy. So that lab test told me nothing other than my zones were already accurately set. So this idea that the average person needs labs is completely and utterly unfounded. If you execute these field tests well, you are the vast majority of the way there. And then down a step from that, if you genuinely can't afford a heart rate monitor or a nice watch, or say you're using Strava on your phone like some people do, then this idea of the other tests is really helpful. And I think it's just important that we don't game those. So the idea, exactly what you've mentioned, about 7 to 8 words, if not more, something that I found quite helpful to give to my athletes, because people will say, oh, I was talking or I was conversational, but it's the classic breathing in between words and not really having a truly conversational pace. You'll hear that a lot, conversational pace. If you're running on your own and you don't want to look like a loony talking to yourself out loud, saying the numbers out loud is just the same. If you can count out loud to, say, 10, you're probably working in zone 2 if you're not having to take a massive
Make sure
breath.
it's a shadow box whilst you're doing that as well.
Absolutely.
So that, everybody knows what you're all about. Yeah.
No one messes with you then. But yeah, the same with nasal breathing. As you said, you can get better at it. And there used to be, I think it's sort of 4 now, it was, again, one of the fads of the industry about the breathing gears, and zone 2 being sort of relaxed nasal breathing, and then zone 3 being power nasal breathing, and all of this kind of thing. It is important to remember that you can just game these a little bit by getting better at the act. But yeah, don't obsess over it.
And at the end of the day, the testing side of things is, generally speaking, the environment in which you can test should be then the environment in which you train in the sense that if you are testing to get data, that data is then only applicable if it's mimicked and executed within the same environment again. When in reality, most people are out there training with heart rate monitors and watches. So I think, yeah, there is more. I had a conversation with an American about 4 months ago, sort of top level. As we look to expand into America, I've been having conversations with certain people, and she said that it is clinically impossible to make nutrition recommendations for an athlete without having a monthly blood test and microbiome sort of fecal test. Clinically impossible. No surprises for guessing what industry her main businesses were in. But yeah, it did just blow my mind that there is this perception that there is a narrative out there that's saying it is actually impossible for you to do anything unless you are having these lab tests as a day-to-day human being, which isn't the case, because all you're doing with a lab is controlling the variables as much as possible. Whereas day-to-day, we have tools available to us that aren't quite as close-knit in terms of accuracy, but they're really not a long way off. And just because they're not 100% accurate doesn't mean they're not more accurate than doing nothing at all, I think is the key detail. So I think you're right to bring up the labs, because I think more and more people are believing that they have to spend and spend and spend to know what starting point they're working from, when in reality there's a lot of tried and tested tests that have been with us for a long time that have created some world-class performances and some very middle-of-the-pack performances for people that are working out with a pro setting. And if you're not training like a pro, you might not need the same level of equipment as a pro, which isn't a bad thing. It's just the context that matters. So I think on that's a good point to move into the next one, which is that generally speaking, there's a rule in running, which is that you shouldn't increase your volume by any more than 10% per week, which generally speaking is solid. I think the only caveats there are, unless you have hit that volume consistently in the past, you're recovering from injury, or you've maybe reduced your volume period of travel, something like that. For example, I've ran back-to-back 110, 120 kilometer weeks in the past, and when it's been predominantly zone 2, I've held up. Unfortunately, last time I did end up with a stress fracture in my hip, so that's a pretty tough pill to swallow there. But now that I'm running 30 kilometers a week, again, as I'm feeling really rock solid, I wouldn't go 33 to 36.3. I'd just go 30, 35, 40, maybe even 30, 40, 50, up to a point, because I've been there before and I'll know what the fatigue feels like. That's key caveat number 1. Key caveat number 2 is, if we're applying this to the bike, then you can generally load more zone 2 volume without associated risk of that spike in volume, as long as you're not doing it stupidly and therefore inhibiting recovery. So, I mean, if you went from 50k to 190k, that's unsustainable. Whereas going from 50 to 75 to 100, for example, is something you can do more, because bike riding isn't as impact loading. Your zone 2 volume itself can increase by more than 10% per week in a cross-training setting, I think is something that's worth flagging as well. If you add in some ski erg, if you add in some rowing and it's very low intensity aerobic work, you are going to be pretty hard pressed to injure yourself through overtraining by doing that, unless you're moving inefficiently in those movements. But the crux of the matter is you should cautiously and predictably increase your volume across the board in any discipline week by week, and make sure that that is sensible. Don't increase by 50% week on week until you hit a brick wall and wonder where it all went wrong, because we know where it all went wrong. We could have seen that coming from a mile off. So that is the key. But I think on that, there is a very important nuance here, which is we are huge fans of Zone 2. Don't get us wrong. Huge fans of aerobic training. For a lot of the athletes we work with, it's where they lack, and it's where the biggest bang for their buck in terms of time availability is from a training adaptation point of view. However, that is the key, because there is a curve here where the more time that an athlete trains, the more Zone 2 emphasis there can be, whereas the less time an athlete trains or has available to train, the more actual tangible gains they'll get from doing a higher volume of hard work relative to their overall volume. So by that I mean 80-20 principle. Generally came from high-performing, high-volume athletes that had 20% of their volume being done at high intensity, 80% of their volume being done at low intensity. If you extrapolate this out to the average person that maybe doesn't have 30 hours a week to train, not many people do, if they're training 6 hours a week, then 80-20 applied to that, which has become a very popular term to be thrown around, is maybe not actually creating enough space for that person to allocate enough time per week at a high intensity to elicit the adaptation that they are looking for. And they are not going to be falling short by not doing the same amount of Zone 2 because of the exponential growth of that curve that I referred to, where Zone 2 and aerobic volume becomes more and more sort of impactful in a volume setting the more hours that a person is training. So don't be afraid of high intensity by being aware of the importance of Zone 2. Zone 2 is the foundation on which we layer moderate and high intensity at lower volumes, but they do still have a place. And I think it's important to consider time spent in zones rather than distance spent in zones to start with, because that'll help frame things quite binarily for you to start with. So let's say you do 100 minutes of training a week. 50 minutes of that could be moderate or high intensity, and 15 minutes of that could be Zone 2. That wouldn't be unreasonable. If you're doing 1,000 minutes a week, then you'd probably start to see the pendulum swing much more towards the low intensity side of things, because there's more of an availability there. So I think there's been a bit of a trend recently with the increase of popularity and awareness of aerobic training and how to build your aerobic base that has maybe put some people off doing the harder work in place of just doing another easy session. So avoiding junk mileage is really, really key with hybrid training. It's something that we're huge proponents of. And that's where making sure that the hard intensity, high intensity, difficult, head down, don't want to do it sessions are done with quality. And then the higher volume, lower intensity sessions are done with quality as well. And then there's nothing in the middle that isn't serving a purpose. Whereas I think the obsession with aerobic training and volume can create this sort of middle ground where people are doing a lot of Zone 2 volume for no obvious gain. And that's just something that I wanted to flag, because I think today's topic is how to build your aerobic base. Cautiously increasing your time spent in Zone 1, Zone 2 is, in essence, the way to do that. But that shouldn't come with a fear of high intensity. And the way you should try and frame that is, as your aerobic base builds, your ability to tolerate higher intensity and recover from it sustainably as you cautiously progress that side of things improves concurrently. So build your aerobic base, start layering in moderate and higher intensity work, but don't believe that just churning more and more Zone 2 mileage will be the solution to everything, because it likely won't be and can probably get quite tedious, I'd imagine.
I think there's two little points we could add there potentially, both supported by literature or certainly just to support the points you've made anyway. One being, when we're talking about the 80-20 style training, if you were to look at the scientific literature, that's what you would see termed polarized training, where you're training the two opposite ends of the spectrum, 80% being, or more, being the easy end, and the other pole being the much harder training. And of course, that is supported very strongly by true endurance athletes, and often In the non-impact sports, it might actually even be sort of 90-10. There was a post that almost broke the internet a few years back where it was the training schedule of a world record breaking speed skater was released, and it was essentially a 9 to 5 of aerobic training. It was like 35 hours a week of endurance training broken into five work, sort of Monday to Friday, because he didn't like training the weekend. And people were just mind blown that if you don't have much of a background in endurance sports, you might not realize how much these people train. So these are the people that the 80-20 or the 90-10 principle are being based on. And there is a lot of research that a more pyramidal model, which is still, you think about the base of the pyramid, that's still your easy work. It is still the foundation of what you're doing. Nobody is saying that it shouldn't be, but the base of the pyramid, like that middle section, those middle intensities are still there in a high enough quantity. Because realistically, and we'll get onto this more in a bit, but those middle intensities are not this grey zone where gains go to die like many people make it out to be. It is very, very important. You're realistically going to spend most of the time in the races that people care about. You're not zone 5ing a marathon, or at least I hope you're not. You need time in those middle zones. And then the other bit of literature that I think is probably worth sort of making people aware of in terms of the weekly volume that we're talking about is that there's two elements to look at when you're talking about increasing your volume. One is, of course, the total weekly mileage that we've spoken about. And then the other is just being careful of if you have a long run in the program, so like a typical marathon program where you might have sort of Monday to Friday or Saturday being shorter runs and then Sunday being your long run, whatever. That long run has to be increased safely as well. And trying to spike the distance you're running in that particular long run too quickly is a major red flag for injury. So it's worth just bearing in mind.
I think it's the biggest contributing factor in terms of literature. The biggest contributing factor to injury in running but endurance training in general is a sharp spike in volume. Essentially that is the thing that it doesn't get as much credit as it deserves when things go wrong. And you can look at running gaits, you can point fingers at pronation and things, all of which are kind of getting more and more disproven as time goes on. But people love to point fingers. This is why you got injured. That's why you got injured. You shouldn't have done that. I told you so. When in reality, it's always multifactorial. But generally speaking, the thing that you can control and try and avoid is too aggressive a sharp spike in increase in volume, whether that's cumulatively or in your long run or less so long rides. But because there's more that goes into the sustainability of that, but definitely with your long run because of the transient impact load that comes with it.
There we are.
Cool. I think the key thing to focus on is, I guess, a few mistakes that people often make, which is by not having zones and by just trusting themselves without having any experience in spending time in zones, you will almost inevitably end up running too fast too soon. I used to just run, and I fucking hated running. And I thought, wow, how the hell can anyone run a marathon? This is impossible. As I sent a 5K and sent a 10K once a week at full send with nothing in between. I didn't really understand that you could move at a slower pace and therefore elicit a longer distance. I didn't really compute to me until I started to understand things a little bit more. But the key detail is having these zones helps you dial in your intensity loading so that you're not just kind of arbitrarily going out and turning the tarmac over. Because if you do spend a lot of time inadvertently in zone 3, whilst it's not the grey zone that I think some people refer to it as, where dreams go to die and you'll just go backwards, you are cumulatively loading more than you probably might be able to sustain were you in zone 2. So if you're thinking that you're in zone 2, but actually you're in zone 3 all the time, then you're accumulating a lot more impact, a lot more load, and a lot more fatigue that might catch up with you week 6 into a 10-week plan, for example, because it's off in terms of the calculations. So that's worth bearing in mind. And I think from our point of view, we're really, really keen to help encourage people to consider cross-training in some capacity, utilize other aerobic modalities to help elicit the same response so that you aren't loading quite as much, because we're also, generally speaking, factoring in fatigue from weight training as well, which means that you're juggling many different energy systems and recovery pathways. So the more that you can rely upon eliciting the same response for less overall fatigue will get you closer to your goal with less fatigue accumulated, which is kind of the wave that we're trying to ride along the way. So I think those are the things that I really want to highlight. In essence, you're trying to improve mitochondrial density so that you can turn over more oxygen as you move and sustain that ability over a longer period of time so that you can go and go and go and go. And what's beautiful about this is you can start and it can feel very alien, but it can also be very freeing because it's a lower intensity that you may have never experienced before. It allows you to be able to think, to talk, to engage with the environment in a different way, and to move at a pace that becomes quite leisurely versus quite hard. And that's something that I found a whole load of people have experienced for themselves over the years as they get so used to just working super hard all the time and feeling like they've always got to suffer, otherwise it's not worth doing. But most importantly, it will allow you to build a baseline and a foundation that allows you to go at other things with a lot more aggression. And for me personally, I know when aerobically I can go all day. I just flip a switch at some point. I should be there quite soon, ahead of Project Tenacity. I don't feel that far off it yet. Musculoskeletally running, I don't feel like I'm there yet again, but that's because I haven't been doing as much volume this year because of the running injury. But on the bike, as long as I can keep eating, I don't feel like my aerobic capacity is below the threshold required to be able to just keep fueling the fire so that the engine can keep turning over. That's come from a lot of training, but the beauty is, generally speaking, if you are able-bodied and you have the ability to stimulate your aerobic system, you can achieve the same outcome through cumulatively loading over time. And it's a great feeling. To feel aerobically fit gives you the option to move in lots of different directions, and then you can start layering in intensity, you can start layering in other modalities, and these don't have as much of an impact on you and your overall fatigue and recovery and potentially quality of life because you're getting to do more fun things that don't take as much from you. Whereas we have a lot of people come to us that are trying to do so many things at once but don't necessarily have the fitness to be able to actually adapt to all of those things concurrently or even recover from doing multiple things. So to build that aerobic base gives you the ability to recover, to adapt, and to move in different directions much more efficiently than you would was that aerobic base undertrained. So that's that. I don't think we missed out any key points. I mean, how to build, there was no point in us trying to dress it up into anything special. How to build your aerobic base is a simple process, but the key detail is starting from the foundation of individuality rather than generalization.
I think on that, there's a point here that often gets missed. We're so wrapped up in the fitness industry bubble a lot of the time that we forget who benefits from these conversations the most, and that's, of course, the average person. If you pluck the average person off the street, there's a good chance that they might not actually be able to run in Zone 2. And this is a common issue when people first get started. They say, yes, I hear you. Okay, I understand what you're saying. It sounds like polarized training will help me or the 80-20 principle will help me, but I actually cannot do it because when I start running, I'm so deconditioned or I'm at a point where my heart rate goes straight to 160. I'm straight in Zone 3. And for those people, you might be training for a marathon, you might be training for running, but don't be afraid of the other tools. It's far easier to modulate the intensity on something like a bike, for example, where you're not bearing your body weight. It's particularly easy for most people to remain in Zone 2. And then you still get the benefit of all of the work that we've spoken about on this podcast without the inability to actually put those principles into place, because they do work, but you just have to acknowledge where you're at. And I think when we're having this conversation and other coaches out there, just have to be mindful of including that and bearing in mind that not everybody can adhere to these principles without some adaptation. So just worth having other tricks up your sleeve. Use the other tools at your disposal. Row, ride, swim if you're good at it, for example. Anything that allows you to put these principles into practice will all be helpful in the long run, regardless of if they're not directly your goal.
Agreed. I think final point. What do you think the trigger should be for somebody to start implementing some higher intensity work into their training if they are starting from scratch to build that aerobic base?
For me, it's once they've hit the threshold where they can understand and sort of comfortably complete a run to the point where a lot of people, exactly what you've mentioned, they don't enjoy running. They think that they have to go and max effort a 5K or a 10K. Once somebody has that under control, once they've got that pacing under lock a little bit, and they've spent a few weeks at it, because I think especially with talk of the 10% rule and things like that, it's easy to think, well, I have to increase my volume by 10% or whatever. You don't have to increase by these numbers every time. Once you've got to a point where you've held steady for, say, 4, 6, 8 weeks, and you've increased to a point where you're comfortable going out for a run, now you can start to implement some of the harder work. And don't be afraid to do so, because it's such a powerful stimulus. It's going to do far more. Obviously, I'm putting completely arbitrary numbers on this now, but say an easy run is worth 2 points to your fitness, then a hard run might be worth 5. and therefore you're going to stack more points quickly. And of course, I've completely arbitrary made up numbers there, but
Yeah. And the key
point
detail is you can't just do 5 points, 5 points, 5 points,
exactly.
5 points, 5 points.
Yeah.
You need to choose when you pull that lever.
Exactly. But I think as soon as somebody is comfortable, because the issue is exactly what you've mentioned, if you don't have the ability to control that pace, you get this bleed over between your easy runs are no longer easy because you're not applying that throttle control properly, you're bleeding over into the other zones, which means one, you're tired for your harder work, but you don't have this sort of mental separation between the two. Once you can say, no, I am deliberately holding back, I am keeping this easy run easy, and therefore it gives you the capacity to push your hard work harder. Because I think one of the things that we see quite a lot is a lot of people are essentially, if I give them an interval session straight away early on, they're just running the same paces as they would be in a steady run, just broken up, because they don't have this differentiation yet. You've essentially just done a broken up tempo or steady run. When you've got this ability to dial back the easy runs and then actually have some differentiation between your hard runs, that's when I think you're now in a position to start pushing them. And I see this a lot in perhaps I think the first year of running, maybe a bit less, depending on how sort of mentally resilient you are. I don't think most people are actually capable of truly pushing themselves to their limit. You might, if you ask somebody brand new to go and run a 5K, they're not actually going to run to their sort of physiological limit fitness right now because they don't have that skill of pacing. They don't have that skill of pushing through the uncomfortable bit. And I think once you understand all of these different zones and thresholds, you start to unlock that. You start to realize that, oh, my heart rate is elevated, it's only mildly uncomfortable, I'm not going to die, versus, okay, yeah, this is true, zone 5C, as we mentioned, send help. There's a clear marker there. And yeah, I think it all just comes down to this ability to keep easy runs easy and hard runs hard. And as long as you have the ability to have that marker between them, then you're in a good place to push both.
And it's very important to remember that perceived exertion is a skill that is built up over time, and you need to fail, you need to work hard, you need to work easy to be able to build that ability to discern what a RP6, RP7, zone 5A, 5B, 5C feels like, etc. And be patient. I think the modern world is very impatient. Training is a great way of making one patient. And yeah, I've experienced RPE 13 before, which annoyingly then becomes RPE 10 because it recalibrates you. So then RPE 9 is suddenly what your previous RPE 12 was, even though the scale only goes to 10. Again, training for a 5-minute mile for me, for example, was a great example of my perception of effort going from X to Y. And that comes through trial and error. But the foundational principles are the same, which is that having an aerobic base allowed you to pursue these activities. And look, if you take some time off training for a certain discipline, one zone 2 session in that activity per week will hold on to a lot more than you think when it comes to swimming, biking, running, rowing, erging, whatever it might be, than you give it credit for. You don't need to be caning it in each discipline all the time. Maintaining the skill, plus maintaining the engine, plus maintaining the musculoskeletal movement and the patterns is, generally speaking, what we are looking to do before you layer in race-specific preparation. Great example. I've gone away, having not ran for 14 weeks, and I've come back to pretty much running at the exact same zone 2 pace as I did previously because I've maintained the engine with cycling. Musculoskeletally, my IT bands, my glutes, and everything feel battered from running, but they're starting to adapt again. But the actual engine aerobically that sits beneath the hood, so to speak, whilst the hood has got some bodywork issues, the actual engine itself is still firing on all cylinders. And I'm quickly running out of knowledge about engines to be able to sort of keep this going. But I think that's the important thing, is you can elicit a huge amount of adaptation through doing a lot of easy work. But don't let that be what makes you afraid of the hard work, because the hard work is what's going to accumulate more tangible improvements in your fitness by virtue of it being hard. So there we are. A bit of a whistle-stop tour on how to build your aerobic base and how not to build your aerobic base, more importantly. But I think in simple terms, hopefully that makes it a bit more clear in terms of what details matter and what details don't matter, because it is simpler than it may often be made to seem. And the key detail is working from a baseline of individual understanding so that you can build from there to learn, adapt, and apply changes over time. Trial and error. That's all this is, really, isn't it?
It's just rinse and repeat. I think you learn such a huge amount from just going out, exactly as we've said, doing a few, perhaps you're failing, a few maximal efforts, and it recalibrates everything, and you learn so much. It bleeds across into everything.
That's it. Fantastic. Well, I feel like I'm in a good place for my aerobic base, which is nice. It's kind of annoying because it means I've got a lot of hard work to do now. You turbo trainers. God.
You said it on the podcast now, and now you can't be the one to not follow your own.
That was a forced accountability thing there. It's just I don't like getting on the turbo to do really hard sessions at the moment. I'd much rather just go out and ride my bike and cane it for an hour or so, but the weather, unfortunately, is not allowing me to do that. So we'll see. See, even then, I've got comfortable with aerobic work over the summer where I'm doing hard work again. I'm like, oh no, I don't like it. So don't fall into that trap like I am exposing myself for and maybe confronting directly for the first time in a while. But the key detail is layer in the easy work, to layer in the moderate work, to layer in the hard work, and you will move in the right direction. Build your volume cautiously, sustainably, sensibly over time, and you'll be able to do this for a long time. If you spike those things too aggressively, it increases your chance of injury, and nothing will inhibit your process more than being injured for a sustained period of time. So if you can avoid that, everybody wins.
Ideal.
Thank you, Kieran. Good chat as always.